back here. I always remember fondly my first time in Australia at the EGA conference in 2007. This is a considerably more elaborate gathering, but I see many familiar faces and many new friends as well. So I want to thank everyone involved, and there's quite a roster of them, as you know. Martin for the introduction and his behind-the-scenes work, and Doran and Jonathan, Kath and Kitty and others. I just ran into Michael Bachty a few minutes ago, who hosted me last time. So this is, I just feel like I'm among friends again. And I just love Australia. It's a wonderful place. They're wonderful people. So I'm told I have 45 minutes for this talk, so I better get on with it. I put it a little bit on fast forward, but maybe we'll get through it. Hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. The title of this talk, as you can see, is Origins of the Human Imagination. Martin mentioned the Hefter Research Institute. I put that up there. I'm going to have a couple of affiliations, but the Hefter is a group that is doing excellent work back in the States to investigate mostly psilocybin for clinical applications, both in the study of basic consciousness functions, things like the mystical experiences, but also its application in hospice situations to help people come to terms with terminal cancer and that sort of thing. And I encourage you to look at the website and see what's going on. Quite a lot, actually. And as you know, I'm an ethnobotanist, and I'm interested, have been for a long time, in sort of the chemical ecology that we inhabit on this biosphere. Plants are basic chemists, and that chemical interaction defines, in many respects, regulates the functions of the biosphere. And since we're part of that, we are included in that equation, although sometimes we tend to forget it. But, so that's kind of this is very speculative talk, but that's kind of the theme of it. And the first thing I'd like to draw to your attention is how different plants are from us. Right? Plants and people are quite different. Although if you look closely, you might see that people can sometimes recognize and resemble plants. Plants are different in many ways that are obvious. They tend not to move around. They don't behave in the way that animals do. They don't respond to their environment that way. They have very interesting reproductive habits, often and customarily requiring the assistance of a third unrelated species. And one of the biggies is that they can photosynthesize. They have mastered this trick called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is something that we should all give thanks for every day, because if it weren't for photosynthesis, we wouldn't be here. Photosynthesis is the means by which energy from the sun, from the solar system, is brought into the biosphere and integrated into biological processes. Plants are chemists, and plants have mastered this trick to make an enormous variety of organic molecules from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. And they are very integral to maintaining the carbon dioxide balance in the planet, and our deforestation of particularly tropical rainforests is upsetting that balance. And to our detriment. But plants are the main way that carbon dioxide can be removed from the atmosphere. And so plants have this ability to use sunlight to make complex organic molecules. So they have literally energy to burn. And because they do, they make an enormous variety of complex organic compounds, not all of which occur in all plants. They make, of course, the fundamental molecules of life, DNA, proteins, phospholipids, this sort of thing, which are found in all organisms, without which we wouldn't be organisms. But then they go beyond that and they make what are called secondary compounds. Not compounds that are found in all plants, but that are found in specific groups of plants. Well, what do they do with all these different complex organic molecules? This chart here kind of shows the pathways. In the yellow boxes here are the secondary compounds. These blue ones are kind of the universally occurring biological compounds. It all starts with carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. And plants use chlorophyll to capture the energy of the sun and literally split water, ionized water, with that energy, using that reductive energy from the ionization of water that feeds into organic synthesis pathways. Of course, first starting with your simple sugars up here. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but leading eventually to these classes of secondary compounds. Like each one of these big boxes here represents categories of thousands and thousands of compounds of molecular diversity, and including the nitrogen compounds, the alkaloids, which are so important in medicine, the monoterpenes, which are the source of many, many things, the aromatic compounds, the plant steroids, the carotenoids that give leaves their color and fruits their color, the phenolic compounds. So these are all secondary categories of plants. Well, but these are not found universally in plants. These are found, these secondary compounds, and it's really a misnomer to call them secondary, because that implies that they're not important. Well, they are important. But the question is, what are they doing there? I mean, do plants just make these things out of exuberance? They have a lot of energy left over. They can kind of spin out compounds and have fun. Well, I'm sure they do have fun. Doing this. But what do they do with all these compounds? They're great chemists, natural products chemists, as Martin can tell you, are still learning from natural products. Drug discovery is a very important area of science, but the organic chemists, all natural organic chemists, of course, still look to the natural world for the molecular templates to give them the ideas that will lead to the medicines of the future. So this is another reason to preserve this biodiversity, and especially in tropical rainforests. Well, here's what they do with these things. A famous botanist once said, plants substitute biosynthesis for behavior. In other words, animals react to their environment through behavior, the typical flee or fight reaction. If they are in danger, they can move away from it. They can run away. Plants can't do that. So they do their language, and their adaptation to the environment is through biosynthesis. And that's what these secondary molecules are. They're messenger molecules in a certain sense. They mediate the relationship of plants with other organisms in their environment at all levels, right? From fungi and bacteria in the soil to herbivores that might want to interact with the plants, to even, of course, including humans. So through this secondary chemistry, plants tie the biosphere together and regulate it. You can think of the biosphere, even on the planetary level, as a kind of a cell. And if any of you have had cell biology, you know that it's all about signal transduction. Things bind to the surface of the cell, the receptors are activated, and molecules are change conformation inside, and activate gene transcription and this sort of thing. Well, plants are mediating the same kind of activity across the planetary biosphere, across the community of species. And they do so with, as it says here, other plants, other organisms, fungi, and of course, humans. And they use these secondary compounds for many different things. Defense is an obvious one. Many of these things are toxic and are useful repellent compounds, or they're bitter compounds that would tend to send a message to an herbivore or another organism to basically stay away. I don't taste good, and I'm not something you want to eat. Of course, humans, being naturally curious, have sort of perverted that, and many psychoactive compounds contain alkaloids, and alkaloids as a class tend to be bitter. So a human can come along, nibble on a leaf or something bitter. Maybe this is interesting. Something like that. So that's one of the main functions of these secondary compounds. Essentially, defense, to send a defensive message, or to establish territoriality. Some of these compounds are toxic to other plants in the environment, or perhaps bacteria and fungi that might be pathogenic, except the toxins keep them away. Two other important functions, which are illustrated here, are semiosis or symbiosis. Semiosis, from the term semaphore, something that sends a signal. A semaphore sends a signal, and many of these secondary compounds send a signal, which might overlap with the repellent function. The repellent function might say, stay away. But on the other hand, the chemical signal might say, come hither, interact. The color of a flower, for example, or the patterns in flowers that you can only see in UV light, which insects can perceive.
I will be heard.
So semiosis, you see this often in the interaction between insects and plants. This is where the function reaches its highest level of sophistication, because flowering plants usually require the intercession of an insect colony with its life cycle. So the plant has all sorts of mechanisms to attract insects. So that's one aspect of it.
Yeah, that's fixed.
All right. Go back. And symbiosis is also, a part of this. In other words, symbiosis, as you probably know, is a close association, usually a beneficial association between organisms, between different species. And the obvious trivial example is the symbiosis between, say, insects and plants, because the insects collect the pollen, get the nectar, make honey, and conveniently help the plant maintain its life cycle. So these are just some trivial examples of processes in the ecosystem that are mediated by plant secondary compounds. Well, we are not different from this. It's often said that you are what you eat, and that's true. We are immersed in this chemical ecology like everything else, and the substances that we bring into our bodies for nutrition, but also for other purposes. You've all probably heard the term nutraceutical. Well, that's essentially that is a compound that has both the properties of a nutrient, and a medicine, and this is very common. So we humans are part of this symbiosis, and we have co-evolved with these plant secondary compounds, and we have developed complex enzymatic mechanisms to adapt to the chemical ecology, the chemical environment that we live in. So every person, depending on what they consume, what they eat, and breathe, and put on their bodies, and all these interactions, is a biochemical individual. This is the basis of biochemical individuality. We have enzymes in our livers and other parts of our body that are inducible, that respond to stimuli from the environment and change the biochemical profile. So, if you're a, 3 lattes in the morning and a bagel guy, like I used to be, your metabolism is going to be very different than somebody who just has a cup of yogurt and maybe a glass of juice. That'll show up in your biochemical characteristics. Plants mediate this symbiosis between humans.
symbiosis is agriculture. This technology was discovered spontaneously, apparently, about the same time in different parts of the world, around some places about 4,000 BC, other places about 8 to 5,000 BC. But the discovery of agriculture completely changed civilization. In fact, it made civilization possible. Because of agriculture, it was possible to have settled, it was possible to make the transition from nomadism to settled civilization. And once you had that, then essentially that provided the basis for culture to flower and culture to appear. We became reliant on cultivated plants, and we started breeding plants unconsciously, not like in a genetics lab, but just selecting the plants that were cultivated for desirable properties, taste or color, and that sort of thing. So, we made that transition from the hunter-gatherer wild foragers to agriculturalists, and that made a great deal of difference because this, essentially, we took roots, a literal rooting, and if it weren't for the symbiosis with plants, we would not have the civilization that we have. I mean, this is what it all rides on. And as a result of this formalization between plants and humans, formalized symbiosis, we can establish settlements and all that goes with it. Specialization in labor, art can flourish more. All sorts of religions, institutions, governments, law. It all rides on this symbiosis, this cultural symbiosis that's driven by the plant-human symbiosis. So this process of establishing the symbiosis between plants and humans as the basis of culture essentially has overtaken biological evolution now. Biological evolution, the process of natural selection, has it still operates, but it operates on a much slower time scale than cultural evolution. And as a result of this, we see this cultural evolution, this cultural acceleration of change, which started about 10,000 years ago, and has just gotten faster and faster ever since. And we see, now we're reaching some sort of critical point in this acceleration of cultural and cognitive evolution. Well, it's a two-way street. Not only have plants impacted us, humans, in terms of our adaptation to the environment, but we have had an influence on the plants themselves, as I mentioned, through breeding, through selective breeding and domestication of plants. So here's a couple of examples. Brussels sprouts, which I'm sure you all love, and cannabis. And these plants are human artifacts. They don't really exist outside of nature. I mean, these are as much an artifact as a computer, or a bicycle in a sense. These, would never have evolved in a natural situation. We have taken them under our wings, so to speak, and we breed them for properties that we find desirable. And cannabis is a very good example, as is most of our important medicinal plants. We have varieties that we breed for fiber and varieties that we breed for nutrients, for the seed, for the oil in the seeds, and of course for the resins, for the psychoactive properties. And cannabis as such doesn't exist in the wild anymore. It's essentially a domestic plant. It arose from a wild progenitor, but that's been lost now. So it could not exist. And many of our important medicinal plants are in that situation. They opt for the sort of evolutionary free ride that they get by having us take care of them. But it's a kind of a pact with the devil, because if we go down, they go down. Of course, if we go down, probably the whole planet goes down, which is why we have to be careful. If you look at secondary compounds in plants and their impact on humans, you can look at it from a couple of different perspectives. Dietary exposure to secondary compounds in humans has effects on both the phenotype and on the genotype. So on the phenotypic side, as you know, is the side of gene expression that's visible. It essentially is the effect of gene expression. And plant secondary compounds human exposure to plant secondary compounds in the diet can lead to changes in behavior, which again is a chemically mediated response, such as avoidance or recognition, or various detoxification mechanisms that might be developed. Many of the world's important food plants are actually toxic, and they have to be processed in a certain way before they can be consumed. There is also the activation of these physiological adaptation mechanisms I was talking about. Certain enzymatic pathways become more or less elevated in terms of their gene expression, so that in a particular environment you can consume a plant, you can become adapted to food that normally would be toxic. You have to eventually become adapted to it. And similar effects go on with the genome. You get these secondary compounds do have feedback to the nucleus and to DNA, so they have direct effects on the genotype as well. They can alter the structure of DNA. They can alter DNA RNA processes, either at the level of gene expression or post gene expression. They have post-transcription effects on the proteins that are produced through genetic activity, and they lead to molecular changes in these specific enzyme products. So those two routes of change leads to initiated variations in diverse metabolic processes. In other words, it changes the way our biochemistry works, and it also changes our genetics. It leads to essentially modifications in disease susceptibility. For example, if you live in an environment and consume a plant regularly which has, say, immune modulating activity, immune stimulating activity, you're likely to be in a population that's less susceptible to disease than your neighbors across the valley. So you've got an evolutionary advantage there, lower rates of disease. And another example is, changes in group biological fitness as well as individual biological fitness to the environment, and shifts ultimately in gene frequencies based on these processes of differential survival and reproduction. So that leads to evolutionary consequences. So what's the take-home lesson here? The take-home lesson is that plant secondary chemistry is directing human evolution to the extent that there is a direction in human evolution. And the evolutionary biologists would dispute that, or that's an open question. Some say apparently there is. Others say no, it's all just random shuffling around of genes. We don't really know. But where it really gets kind of interesting is when we look at the human neural evolution, the evolution of the human brain, which is one of the big puzzles of evolutionary biology. As you can see here, on this scale here, this is brain capacity at the bottom in cubic centimeters, and this is over on the other axis, millions of years, right? And this is, this is a little out of date, this diagram, but it's always out of date. I mean, I know some have an updated one and the picture changes, but this shows the basic sort of understanding of human paleoanthropology. And we have there, and I guess the most important thing to notice is that at certain points there's a steady increase in cranial capacity, a steady increase in both the size and the complexity of the human brain over time. Homo habilis, some of you probably have heard of Lucy, who was one of the first kind of quasi-modern hominids. Homo habilis was about 1 to 2 million years ago, had about 900 cubic centimeters capacity. Homo erectus, one of the kind of more recent progenitors of our species, Homo sapiens, is up to about 1,100 or 1,200 cubic centimeters, and that's also, the span of Homo erectus is, takes off about where Homo habilis left off. So we have these different species. Finally ending up here, Homo sapiens actually has neurologically modern humans. Homo sapiens actually have a slightly smaller brain than their presumed close relatives, the Homo neanderthalensis. But Neanderthals were also, big brutes. So they have bigger brain. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're not brutes, but you can't just talk about brain size. You have to talk about brain size versus body ratios. But Neanderthals were essentially, if not modern humans, very, very close to it. What's impressive about this evolutionary diagram is its brevity. What happened essentially is the human neural capacity and human neural complexity exploded over about 2 million years, which is a very short time in terms of evolutionary change. Something triggered that. Something led to the explosive increasing size of the human brain. What did that? We don't know, but presumably it was an adaptive response to selective pressures in the environment. Just think about the brain for a bit. It is actually the most complex structure that we know of in the known universe. The number of synapses in the brain is about 100 and 500 trillion synapses. So one single brain has more connections than the global internet. And the Milky Way galaxy, just by comparison, contains about 100 billion stars. So if in the brain each synapse is a star, our brains are the equivalent of 1,000 galaxies. So here we have, this piece of spongy flesh inside our skulls, which is absolutely the most complex and highly organized piece of matter that we have so far encountered in the universe. And in that brain, the brain uses neurotransmitters, which are messenger molecules to the language of the brain is a chemical language, just like the language of plants is. And many of the neurotransmitters, which are the molecules that mediate the crosstalk between these neurons, these large articulated cells that form these connections, the molecules that mediate that, the chemical crosstalk, are these neurotransmitters, which are usually small molecules. And interestingly enough, many of these molecules are essentially like plant chemicals. And in fact, many of the major neurotransmitters are derived from dietary amino acids that we do not make. We have to consume plants. Things like phenylalanine and tyrosine and tryptophan primarily are the amino acid precursors of neurotransmitters like dopamine, the so-called catecholamines, and things like transmitters like serotonin, which we'll be talking a lot about. So when it comes to psychopharmacology, I think that what Salvador Dali said when they asked him, where did you get the ideas for these wild paintings that you do? Do you take drugs? He said, no. He said, I don't take drugs. I am drugs. And if you think about that, that's exactly right. That is a profound insight. That's not a joke. We are made of drugs. That's why drugs work. We're biochemical agents. We have this complex neurochemistry, which is cross-talking between these neurons, and the crosstalk molecules are things that we ingested in plants. So, plants are very intimately involved in these processes of consciousness. And in psychopharmacology, most psychoactive drugs affect either the synthesis or the storage or the release or the degradation or the uptake of these neurotransmitters. The secondary compounds and the synthetic molecules that we develop based on secondary compounds essentially block or mimic or the effects of neurotransmitters. So they're very important, and neurotransmitters, the neurochemicals evolved from the same evolutionary precursors and serve the similar functions. These molecules in plants were also messenger molecules, but they were messenger molecules released into the environment, into this chemical environment. And these molecules have become internalized in us, and now sort of internal signal transduction function. So, how far am I into it? I have no idea how long it's passed. Oh, maybe not. No, I do. I have a little thing here that tells me. So think about this for a minute. How different we are than everything else, every other organism on the planet. The human species is a very anomalous critter. There's nothing quite like it, and that's both miraculous and also somewhat problematic. For one thing, we are the only species that has a complex language. We are the only, other animals use language, but nothing like the way we use it, right? Primitive by comparison. We are the only technology-utilizing species, and we're the only species that has figured out a way to store information outside of ourselves in a non-genetic way and transmit it non-genetically both through generations, through technologies like writing and oral history and these sorts of things, all based on language, right? As well as transfer it across geographies. And it mediates the interactions between culture across spatial distances as well as temporal distances. So as a result of our dependence on language and this sort of uniqueness of the human brain to generate and utilize language cognitively, we live in a world of ideas. We live in a world in which symbols, abstractions, are as important and as real for us, and sometimes more real for us, than anything in the physical world. And because we have this symbolic capacity, which appears at some point in this evolutionary process, this is the foundation of human culture. Human culture is comprised of art, of science, religion, magic, myth, all of these things, technology, everything that what we think of, these human inventions that are uniquely human, that set us apart from other organisms, even other hive organisms, and it can be argued that in some ways we are hive organisms, So much of this human culture rides on language. And if it weren't for this extraordinary complex brain, which grew up from somewhere, this wouldn't be happening. It's all dependent on this neural complexity. And a great deal of the human neural structures are devoted to the comprehension of language, the generation of language and the comprehension of language. This is clear. We know this from neuroanatomy, that the linguistic areas, the generation, processing, and understanding areas are a rather large percentage of human neuroanatomy. So the question is, how old is this? When did this start to happen? When essentially did consciousness, which you can kind of define as the ability to relate meaningfully to symbols, how long ago did abstractions become important? How long ago did this ability to derive meaning from essentially meaningless images or meaningless sounds to apportion meaning to these things? When did that happen? Well, we don't really know, but we can speculate. And one way you can speculate about this is one way you can actually look at the archaeological record to get a handle on this is artistic expression, obviously. I don't think artistic expression is not possible if you're not conscious. And so you can look back into the record, and then it gets problematic, but you can look at something like these artifacts here. The oldest real intimation of a human aesthetic sensibility are dated to about 200 to 300 kilo years ago. In other words, 300,000 years ago. Some of them even maybe 500,000 years ago. 500,000 years. Now, these artifacts are, there's some dispute. Are these really human? Are these made by humans? Or do they just happen to be natural much more recent. These are 500,000 years old. And if they were human, if they were made by Homo, they weren't made by Homo sapiens. They were made by probably Homo erectus. So, this is about as far back as we can go when it comes to actual concrete evidence that there was something happening, that consciousness was erupting, was flourishing, or not flourishing, at least taking root in the human species back that far. Well, if you come, several 100,000 years up the line, if you look at something like the Bombos cave in South Africa, now you're up to 70 to 80 kilo years ago, only 80,000 years ago. But that is the first place where you find this unambiguous evidence of human abstraction. You find these carved blocks of ochre with clear geometrical designs and shells with holes carved in them that they figure were made of necklaces and this sort of thing. So there's a big gap in there. There's early evidence that consciousness was evolving, and then you have to come back up to essentially less than 100,000 years ago. But about 100,000 years ago, something, again, there was a sort of a trigger in this process. And, it appears in different parts of the world, such as the South African site, but then suddenly you see it all over the world. You see it in different places. And, of course, Graham Hancock, who we're delighted and blessed to have here, is going to elaborate on this a lot more. But this is, the cave art and other ancient forms of artistic expression are just an amazing lens into the origin, the birth of the human imagination, if you want to think of it that way. Cognitive abilities, once it appeared in one culture, again, just exploded over the world. It's like, it seems to be the 100th monkey hypothesis or something. Once this appears in one area, then it triggers its appearance in other parts of the world. So, what triggered it? Well, of course, it was the monolith, right? I suppose most of you, I hope this is not so dated that most of you have not seen 2001, which if you have not seen it, you should go see it immediately. It's still possibly the greatest science fiction novel, or movie ever made. But Stanley Kubrick's idea of the monolith was a catalytic event, something that was what Riddle Otto called a mysterium tremendum, a tremendous, incomprehensible, and terrifying mystery, something that's wholly alien, something that is completely outside of time or space or human thought, something that, and the monolith is a good sort of analogy for this. It's something that we don't understand that erupts into human history at critical moments and actually affects events, affects the course of evolutionary and cultural and historically events, sometimes in subtle ways and sometimes in not so subtle ways. And so the analogy of the monolith is a very interesting compound. We ask what triggered these critical evolutionary events. Did something just reach in and tweak something, God, you could call it, or the monolith, or the aliens, or whatever, and have this effect, right? And we tend to attribute the trigger to something outside of our normal can. It's certainly outside of our normal can, but we tend to think of it as something that comes from outside, the whole, deus ex machina concept. But what I'm here to speculate, and I'm sure you already know, is that we don't have to go to Jupiter to find this trigger. All we have to do is look into nature. And nature finds the monolith itself in the form of these molecules, these psychoactive, serotonin-affecting, simple molecules, derivatives of amino acids, which are universally found in all organisms. Compounds like psilocybin psilocybin mushrooms. They're very common. And it may be, what my thesis is here, is that the naturally occurring psychedelics reside in nature and exist as the sort of natural analog to the monolith in human evolution and history. It's the psychedelic experience accessed by humanity since the earliest Paleolithic times through the use of these fungi and plants. It's the information that's gained from these psychedelic states that nudges cognitive evolution forward. At various times in prehistory and at critical moments in history, our encounters with the psychedelic experience have completely changed, essentially, what our species is. So, these mushrooms, this is one example that you're probably all familiar with. I guess they grow in Australia, in tropical areas. Psilocybe cubensis, the golden caps. But in critical areas, there's, in temperate areas, it's another species, it's Psilocybe semilanciata. These psilocybin-containing mushrooms are quite widespread, and they affect serotonin, of course. Serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters. It's probably the master neurotransmitter of the brain, derived from tryptophan, an essential amino acid, and it regulates processes such as sleep and mood. The major antidepressants work on the synthesis and reuptake of serotonin. It works on perception, on eating behavior, on the sexual response, and of course on perception. And most of the classical hallucinogens work on the serotonin receptors. They work especially on a particular class of serotonin receptors called the 5-HT2A receptors. Chemically, serotonin is known as 5-hydroxytryptamine, so it's sometimes called 5-HT in the literature. And there are many types of serotonin receptors in the brain, about 14 different subtypes. But the 5-HT2A receptors appear to be the ones that the classical hallucinogens such as psilocybin, DMT, LSD, mescaline, all target these same receptors. And of course, psychedelics are known especially for their effects on visual perception or perceptual effects of one type. But they affect visual perception in profound ways. And we see this in the shamanic iconography, both contemporary, but for example, this painting by Martina Hoffman, and the peyote yard paintings inspired by peyote among the Huichol people, the jaguar mask and other Huichol. These are clearly influenced by the colorful hallucinations and abstract designs that you see in psychedelic states. So these things are very common in nature. And inevitably, if you're a foraging hungry primate, willing to test anything and taste anything, just about anything that you might come across in your environment, it seems like it's a perfect setup for either the accidental or the deliberate interaction of these curious humans, these curious monkeys, with these psychoactive plants. And once this discovery was made of the sort of transcendent states that these plants triggered, that knowledge, again, exploded through human culture. We don't know where it first happened, but within about, some of the oldest records are the Tasali mushroom shamans from Algeria. That's 8,000 BC. There's evidence here of the Selva Pascuala cave in Spain shows mushroom icons. These miniature mushroom stones from Guatemala, somewhere between, again, around 10,000 years, maybe a little less than 10,000 years, up to the present, really. But these different psychedelic cultures emerged in different parts of the world, and we see them through their iconography, through the San Pedro cactus of the Chavin culture, the snuff trays from Coral, the most ancient civilization in the New World, dating back to about 5,000, 6,000 BC. Peyote button remains from Pecos River in Texas, about 4000 BC. So again, the knowledge of the use and utilization of these psychoactive plants within the human religious practices all took place in different parts of the world at about the same time. These technologies were discovered. Well, so what's this have to do with language? Well, if it weren't for language, I think we've established there wouldn't be really any human culture. Culture is made of language, and it rides on language, and complex language, such as we employ without even thinking about it, depends on the relationship between abstract ideas and signification. It's the signification that's the important thing, not so much the abstraction. It's the union of the two, the unification of abstraction, symbol, that leads to comprehension, that leads to cognition. And cognition, in some way, is another word for consciousness, something that involves attention and this linkage of symbol and abstraction. Well, language essentially is the ability to associate meaningless sounds or meaningless symbols with meaning. Suddenly these things take on significance. So that's the key link. And much of neuroarchitecture is linked to this, as dedicated to this ability to associate sounds, images, and symbols. And the ability to derive meaning from these sounds, images, and symbols is synesthesia, if you think about it. Synesthesia is a process of experiencing one sensory modality in terms of another. And people who have taken psychedelics already know what this means, because this is something very easy, very commonly experienced in psychedelic states, where you can see sounds, for example, or hear colors. The translation is often, between what you see and what you hear. Not always. There are other types of synesthetic experiences. But that's a fundamental one. And when you think about what language is, it's exactly that. It's synesthesia. In other words, if you see something, a symbol, a word, or something, it evokes, presumably, in your brain, a kind of a gestalt comprehension of what that is. So, this is why in shamanic traditions we find music and different types of oral stimulation so important, because that sound is used to drive the visionary state. This is synesthesia. Now, some people are genetically synesthetic. They don't need to take psychedelics. Maybe 2% of the population have this ability from birth, and it's just part of their way that they comprehend the world. So, this is a painting by Pablo Emeringo, the Peruvian ayahuasca visionary artist, which is called synesthesia. It's a good example of what is going on. So, is it possible that the spontaneous sort of evolution of language was triggered by the synesthetic experiences that these early primate populations may have been subjected to by consuming the psychedelic plants or fungi that they found in their environment? I mean, this synesthetic process is literally the basis of imagination. Think of the origin of the word imagination. It's the forming of images, right? And so psychedelics essentially worked as neurocognitive programming tools. This is what I'm speculating. We had modern neurology. We had neurologically modern brains, but that was the hardware. Psychedelics come along and become the software, act as the software that develops our brains, that enables our brains to learn cognition, to learn the connection between symbols and sound and meaning. Now, I don't know, but it seems plausible to me. Another interesting aspect of psychedelics is that what you might call portentousness. One of the effects of psychedelics has to do with the perception of meaning in things that might not normally seem so meaningful. And this is one of the things. The portentiousness is a basic dimension of behavior revealed in LSD states, and other, well, in this case LSD, but other psychedelics. It's basically an experience of something as having a meaning or a significance beyond the surface. This is what the kind of thing that lets you, gaze at a rose for 6 hours and see the infinity of the universe in that thing. It becomes portentous. This is the most meaningful experience one has ever encountered. So it leads to experiences of boundlessness and boundaryless events, from the banal to the profane. And out of this feeling of portentousness, this feeling of the significance of these encounters, emerged religion. And religion is a set of beliefs and practices often centered upon specific supernatural moral claims about reality, the cosmos and human nature, and often codified as prayer, ritual, and religious law. Religion encompasses ancestral or cultural traditions, writings, history, and mythology, as well as personal faith and mystic experience. The term religion refers to both the personal practices related to communal faith and to group rituals and communication stemming from a shared conviction. And psychedelics are often found in the context of religious practices, but they are not themselves in religion, a religion. What psychedelics do is enable us to experience religious feelings, religious ecstasy, if you will. They themselves essentially interact with those areas of the brain that mediate this experience, what we sometimes call transcendent or mystical experiences. Well, now, with the modern tools of neurophysiology, we're actually able to look at this. We can use psychedelics such as psilocybin as a molecular tool to study the neuroscience of religion, the neurophysiology of the religious experience. And researchers like Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University, one of our Hefter people, has done amazing work essentially on the neuroscience of transcendent experience. And another gentleman that may be familiar to you, Franz Bolenweider at the Hefter Research Institute in Zurich, is doing PET scanning and giving subjects psilocybin and then shoving them into PET machines and see what part of their brain lights up when they're having these transcendent experiences. Well, it turns out the parts of the brain that light up are the parts that are involved in the mediation of mystical experiences. How well? Oh boy. Well, not too far. What he has found, if you look at this PET scan here, it shows the brain on this is a brain on psilocybin and without psilocybin. And in the psilocybin states, the hot areas are the areas of maximum metabolic activity. This is where the action is. So it gives you sort of you can look into the brain as a movie and see what's going on when you're high on psilocybin. Well, it turns out the areas that are activated on psilocybin are the same areas that are activated in states of deep meditation, in states of shamanic ecstasy, in spontaneous mystical states. If you look at the brains of Tibetan monks in states of meditation, and this has been done, and it's very similar to this. My question is, what happens when you look at the monks on psilocybin? I'd love to know. Another one of the institutions that came out of this was shamanism, which is familiar to all of you. It's a range of traditional beliefs and practices that is concerned with communication with the spirit world. It's essentially a set of techniques. It's a technology. Iliad called it the archaic techniques of ecstasy. And shamanism worldwide has certain features in common. Spirits play important roles in human lives. The shaman is a technician who can interact with those entities and cooperate with those spirits for the community's benefit, which is often concerned with healing. The spirits can be good or bad. These are not necessarily solely benevolent entities. And shamans master techniques to deliberately induce altered states consciousness so that they can access these realms and interact with these entities. And that often involves the use of entheogenic plants. Animals also always play an important role in shamanism. They're messengers, they're allies in the spirit world. And very often in shamanic tradition, the shaman's own spirit leaves his body, his or her body, and goes into the supernatural world in search of other people's souls and in search of information that can be brought back to the community and applied, hopefully in beneficial ways. And very often one of the main objectives here is the curing of illnesses. The shaman is a healer, but the shaman is also a poet. The shaman is a person who has a very specific relationship with language. They are the articulators, kind of the cultural logos of their people. There's a very beautiful essay called The Mushrooms of Language in the book Hallucinogens and Shamanism, which is published many years ago. I like to read this. This explains it well, I think. It says, language is an ecstatic activity of signification. Intoxicated by the mushrooms, the fluency, the ease, the aptness of expression one becomes capable of are such that one is astounded by the words that issue forth from the contact of the intention of articulation with the matter of experience. The spontaneity the mushrooms liberate is not only perceptual but linguistic. For the shaman, it is as though existence were uttering itself through him, or, of course, her. But this was written in 1971. But that's, I think, a very key aspect of shamanism. It liberates the linguistic ability to articulate meaning and the sort of logos of the culture, and this comes. So it makes that neural connection between the poetic ability, essentially the bardic ability, and our neural capacity to undergo these transcendent states of mind. So here we are as a species, and we have evolved with these psychoactive plants for at least 10,000 years, we know, based on the archaeological evidence, and probably much longer ago, at least maybe 100,000 years, maybe as long ago as 500,000 years. And they still affect our culture. They are still important in cultural transitions. We're still learning from them. This is why they're such a hot-button topic, in a sense, because they are part of this evolutionary process that pushes our species forward into ever more novel states of cognition, ever more expanding types of consciousness. And now we're at a point where we're forming symbiosis with our technology, and we're spreading our nervous system around the globe. And psychedelics are important for that. Psychedelics are essentially a learning tool for learning to function in the post cybernetic age. So we are the curious monkey, and we're in a state of cultural, ecological crisis right now. And psychedelics are, through the plants, essentially you can think of these messenger molecules as originating messages from the global community of species, not just the plants, but the entire biosphere that is trying to get this monkey to wake up and understand that what we're doing on the planet is impacting the whole shooting match could go down if we don't wake up. So I think one of the big messages of psychedelics is, many people will agree with this who have had them, that because we are part of nature, and if we don't do that, so if these compounds can be used that way, if they can be used as learning tools, if they can be used in a respectful way to learn from essentially these other species in the environment that are trying to tell us something very important, then we should enable that. We should use these tools as a way to understand both ourselves and the place of our species in nature. And we have to exercise thought and care. These are not, these have their dangers, but approach like anything potent, anything powerful. It has to be approached with respect and with clarity. And so ultimately at this juncture in human evolution, we have to ask this question. We have to ask, which of these mushrooms do we want to remember at the end of our